This morning our speaker is Dr. Caitriona Noonan. Caitriona is Senior Lecturer in Media and Communication in the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University. She is an active researcher in the areas of television production, public service broadcasting, creative labour, which she's going to talk about today, and also cultural policy. And she's co-author of the excellent new book, very recently published, Producing British Television Drama, Local Production in a Global Era, and that's co-written with Ruth McElroy. Caitriona also edited or co-edited the book Cultural Work and Higher Education with Daniel Ashton, and she's going to discuss that a bit later on. Her work has appeared in a number of leading international journals, including the International Journal of Cultural Policy, Cultural Trends, and the European Journal of Cultural Studies. And she's very busy right now because she is principal investigator on an AHRC funded screen agencies as cultural intermediaries negotiating and shaping cultural policy for the film and TV industries within small nations project. And she's also co-investigator at the Centre of Excellence for Policy and Evidence in the Creative Industries. So, just to say, finally, Caitriona has emerged as one of the UK's leading scholars of cultural production, so it is a delight to introduce her talk. And this morning she is talking on building a sustainable creative labour market, challenges for policy making, industry and academia. And like in the last session afterwards, Caitriona will be willing to take questions. So let's thank Caitriona. Thank you.
Thank you for a very generous introduction, and thank you to both Ruth and Dennis for the invitation to present here. And I'm hoping the lack of coffee won't deter anybody, because a lot of the things that have come up in the previous session, I'm hoping we can kind of keep the momentum going on some of those conversations. So I hope the lack of caffeine won't be an issue here. So over the last 2 decades, there has been a growing attention to the issue of work and labour within policy circles. And as part of a strategic initiative to grow media, arts, culture, there is now much more concern with the resources and the initiatives and the interventions to create a workforce which we regard as fit for purpose. So what would fit for purpose look like in our sectors? Well, some of the things, or some of the characteristics it might have, is that it is a labour force which is enterprising, it is a labour force which is mobile, and is flexible to the demands of the sector. It is a labour market that is broad, but also plentiful in terms of skills. It is a labour force that contributes locally, but also operates globally. And while it leverages value from technology, its inherent creativity means that it can't be replaced by technology. So in these ways, labour is an important commodity in the sales pitch to international investors and producers, but also satisfies the local demand for highly skilled jobs. So that's kind of a general kind of primer for this, but I think the word that really resounds with me, or that we've seen much more in the kind of cultural policy landscape, is the word sustainability. To sustain something, to sustain the sector in the long term. And I see that in the rhetoric of the Welsh Government, for instance, in the kind of the Indies, in their kind of press statements. I see it in the House of Lords inquiry recently in relation to television production in the UK. And I've also seen it, for instance, in the Creative Ireland programme and in the Ulster report. It's obviously not an environmental concern. It's much more involved with questions of economic growth. Sustainability becomes an obligatory starting point in thinking about a sector and thinking about the kind of policy interventions that we have for that sector. And we can understand why. Framing the sector in terms of sustainability recognises the considerable risks within that sector. This is a sector that requires high upfront investment, but the demand is very uncertain. It's a highly volatile and changing sector, and so sustainability as an idea, as an ambition, becomes a useful counterweight, And so I want to use sustainability as a kind of a jumping off point today. So I want to do two things. Firstly, I want to outline some of the challenges of building a sustainable creative labour market. And we've begun to hear a little bit some of the points this morning about some of the kind of resources that might be useful in that context. Reflecting on some of the research that we've carried out, I want to see what are some of the lessons that can be drawn, particularly in the context of small countries like Ireland and Wales. What are the challenges of building a sustainable labour market where resources may be fewer? But more ambitiously, but connected to that, I want to challenge some of the taken for granted ideas surrounding sustainability. Particularly because sustainability within policy is often routinely conceived of as economic growth. It emphasises unlimited economic growth through critical mass of intellectual property and rights, through companies and through skills. And while economic sustainability is crucial, I want to provoke a discussion about whether we can also think about sustainability in different terms, as a sector that is socially equitable, culturally diverse, encompassing the long-term interests of citizens. Some of the points that came up earlier on today. While the long-term individual and collective, where within policy we can think about the long-term collective well-being, individual and collective well-being of our market. And I'm addressing both of these within the context of some very ambitious targets within Ireland. Global Ireland seeks to double the size of the film production sector in a period of 5 years to over 24,000 workers. And that is a laudable goal, and it is not my intention to refute plans, but just to consider and to highlight some of the obstacles to that and to invite reflection on the lived experience of that policy goal. What will that mean to the nature of the work itself? And I'm hoping it begins to bridge some of the experiences that we've heard in the first panel from Willie, Anne and Ed, and also then begin to link to the research in the next panel and begin to think about how do we think about individual experiences in the context of structural forces within a marketplace. Just to expand on Phil's introduction and just to kind of give a reason as to why I omit certain things and I focus on other things. I left Ireland in 2003 and I went to work with Enterprise Ireland in the UK. And while I was there, I worked a lot with construction companies and software companies and animation companies. And what was very vivid to me is the challenges of working within a specific sector but trying to access resources and support which is for general economic development. So, and I think governments, including Ireland, have gotten better at realising that the kind of support structures that you have for construction companies don't necessarily work for animation companies or television companies or theatre companies and things like that. And so it's much better at thinking about strategies, though there's a long way to go in some places. As I say, as Phil mentioned, when I left Enterprise Ireland, one of my first outputs was book Creative Industries and Higher Education. And that was a time when the universities were, and indeed still are, beginning to, or having to try and think more creatively about how they intersect with the wider environment to become more inclusive, more responsive to the wider environment. And it coincided with a time when we were thinking more about creative industries. And the book kind of tries to highlight some of the areas where the relationship or the intersection between higher education providers and creative industries is both collaborative but also points of collision. Where are the areas that actually there's a little bit of tension in, and I'll come back to that in a second. Since then I've worked on a few projects, one looking at the development of a new TV drama studio in Cardiff, developed by the BBC in conjunction with the Welsh Government, and another looking at television drama, as Phil mentioned as well. And so labour has been a vivid preoccupation of the discussions with policymakers, with the industry, and often we do this research in collaboration with the sector. I can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A if that comes up. I'm giving this as a kind of a potted history just to kind of emphasise that this talk is very much about the TV sector and kind of extends a little bit about what we did earlier on. But also, more importantly, I want to use this as a journey to highlight that nurturing and building a labour market requires multiple actors, multiple levels of intervention, and multiple sectors to intersect and coalesce. Universities alone can't solve issues around labour. Industry alone can't solve issues around labour, and neither can policymakers. And it's only through collaboration and the intersection between these sectors that we can actually think effectively about building a sector. I come back to that at various points, but I just want to highlight that at the fore. It takes deliberate actions and dedicated spaces for these kind of interventions to happen and to work. And so I hope that this event can be a kind of a catalyst to building some of that momentum and to thinking more creatively about the labour market. Just to give some context to anchor later discussions, and I don't think that any of this will be particularly new to anybody here, but I do think it's useful just to kind of bring it together and see some of the inherent tensions when we talk about questions of creative labour. So there have been profound changes in the last 2 decades that have radically altered the structure and dynamics of the creative sector. These include things like the internationalisation of production. There's always been a very long history of international production, but its scale has increased, and the increased competition between countries for things like Game of Thrones or for Star Wars has increased exponentially. We've also seen a mobility of content beyond platforms, and picking up on what Jeff said at the beginning about kind of maybe thinking beyond platforms. But as providers, particularly the likes of Netflix, attempt to boost their libraries and their resources, we're seeing a tentative emergence of things like, for instance, foreign language content. At the moment, I don't know if any of you are on Netflix watching La Casa de Papel, the Spanish drama. You can watch Welsh language drama, you can watch, there's lots of different, and I think particularly in Wales at the moment, we're seeing much more of the Welsh language producers making use of that and filming, doing things like filming concurrently in Welsh and in English. So for instance, Keeping Faith and Hinterland have both been really successful examples where they've filmed concurrently in both languages, and then that has sold internationally. Finally, there's been a prolonged period of hands-off regulation, especially in relation to ownership and market expansion, which has simultaneously allowed the independent sector to flourish, but, and particularly in the UK, we've seen this a consolidation of the sector into more and more big companies and consolidating power into more and more powerful players. And so this has obviously fundamentally altered the prevailing terms of employment and the contractual status of many employees. So amongst other things, the outcome has been a shift in the precarious forms of employment and the emergence, very much so, of freelancing. In the UK, the creative sector, 47% of creative employees are self-employed, and that compares to 15% in the UK as a whole. While on the one hand, this offers its own rewards and freedoms, it does mean that for a large proportion of our workforce, responsibility for things like progression, for development, for employment costs, like Ruth mentioned around healthcare, or insurance, around sick leave, has shifted entirely to the worker. In work by my colleague Amy Genders about the freelance market in Bristol, she points to the many everyday issues that freelancers face, for instance in accessing a mortgage, in accessing affordable workspaces. And I'm kind of struck a little bit that more and more we're thinking about the similarities between TV workers and Uber drivers more and more as we kind of continue in this space. And I think increasingly this is going to be how we see the kind of the structure of labour forming. But despite all of these issues, in general, cultural work is seen as something which is good. It is good work for the individual, who can exercise freedom and who can be busy. It is good work for the industry because it brings ideas and creativity, and an oversupply of labour means we can keep costs down. And it's good for policymakers who see a critical mass of skilled workers as an asset and their output of creative work as useful in building a country's profile internationally. And Phil, I'm sure, can speak to the value of something like Game of Thrones, for instance, internationally, and the kind of tourism. And I was talking to a colleague here earlier on about the value of Game of Thrones to tourism in Croatia, for instance. But what has emerged from the policy narrative has been that it has never been so good to work, to be a creative worker. And I take that from the Creative Skill Set document. And I would say that for many, but not all, it is. We have a prevailing narrative of meritocracy and entrepreneurship, that working hard and having talent will be enough to get you a creative career. And if you still believe in the myth of meritocracy, or that the success of individual women, ethnic minorities, or other identities can be read as evidence of an entirely inclusive working culture, please read the excellent work of a lot of different academic colleagues, including Susan Liddy, Anne O'Brien, Dave O'Brien, Anna McSaha, Kim Allen, amongst a host of others. I could have named a lot, and I'm just being very selective about who I name here. There is a lot of research which points to the structural inequalities. Through careful analysis of the lived experience and the numbers, so using both the experience and the data, the numeric data we have, they all persuasively conclude that yes, all media workers face career challenges, but there are fundamentally different career outcomes for women, for minority workers, and those from socioeconomic disadvantaged areas. These different outcomes occur as a result of specific work cultures encompassing the education system, and we have a reference to that, career guidance, really in relation to your how we get into education, in relation to funding and commissioning decisions. This means that we're both not getting the talent coming in, and that these people are exiting the profession without achieving their full potential. So all of these pieces of research highlight that we are at the start of a long journey to address significant historical failings within the sector, failings that remain today. And while undoubtedly there are positive actions taking place across lots of different parts of the sector, we need to think about sustainability in broad terms, or the need to think about sustainability in broad terms becomes even more urgent. Otherwise, we are letting these inequalities become passively reproduced. Oh, sorry. So, let me talk a little bit about some of the observations from our own research. The value of a mixed ecology of production, and I think Ed made reference to this, if I just want to pick that up again. One of the fundamental arguments of our work is that balance is key. A sustainable labour market is rarely achieved when it is solely linked to policy imperatives for attracting inward investment from global players, and for doing this to the neglect of indigenous production. An effective ecology of cultural production, what we're all here to talk about, needs a mix of indigenous production and international investment. International production is vital. It builds skills, it builds reputation, it builds credibility. It can be a useful catalyst to a range of other initiatives, whether it be tourism or in terms of building some of the kind of public profile or the international profile of a country. Productions like Game of Thrones and Vikings and sex education in Wales may not put the stories of their countries on the map, but they do put that production sector on the industrial map, and that has value. However, on their own, international investment is not enough, and so it must be done in parallel with building our domestic sector also, and building our domestic capacity. And in television, the holy grail of this is the returning series. The series that comes back every year, every season, and that is long running. In terms of labour development, these kind of series offer routine work. They often offer steady pay, and they allow for the professionalisation of the sector. So I didn't see who mentioned Red Rock, but those kind of productions that allow the kind of transition of people between different grades and between different sectors. And while we often emphasise the high value productions like Game of Thrones, our research points also to the value of high volume production, the soap operas, the mid-sized dramas. Content that generally doesn't seem to have the same prestige or support from policymakers, but does a crucial job in terms of skills development, of structuring careers, and of potentially offering workers a space to home talent, especially in relation to women and minority ethnic groups. In Wales, while productions like Doctor Who will adorn every policy brochure and every kind of promotional work, it is the medical drama Casualty, a kind of a BBC Saturday evening drama, and the Welsh language soap Publicum that do an incredible job in terms of building the skills base within Wales. These high volume productions allow staff to learn, to find their feet and their creative voice, and give them a base from which to grow. It gives workers time to learn a craft. And compared to international productions, they are often less glamorous, but returning domestic series are frequently better able to deliver the policy objectives and promises from our labour initiatives. Yet they rarely have the same forms of support that other productions have, such as, for instance, tax breaks. So a sustainable production sector needs a well-developed tier of productions that offers workers a ladder of opportunity to move up and between. Therefore, establishing something close to a structured career progression route through a mixed ecology of international and domestic content can alleviate, though not eliminate, some forms of precarity within the sector and deliver important forms of upskilling. And that takes me to my next point around publicly funded media. One of the most obvious places that this kind of content emerges is from publicly funded media, or public service broadcasters in particular. Leaving aside the real value of public service broadcasting in terms of cultural representation and public content, for us, public service broadcasters continue to play a huge role in the realisation of a labour market in Wales and in many of the other countries that we've researched. Therefore, the discussion of how we fund public service broadcasters and the development of our labour market shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive. It seems counterintuitive to me that on the one hand we're cutting funding for these, but at the same time looking for structures and ways of building a sustainable sector. In some ways, it is the merging of concerns about how we fund public service broadcasters and why we fund public service broadcasters. That doesn't mean that public service broadcasters are beyond reproach. I've criticised the BBC and Channel 4 and S4C plenty of times in relation to their transparency and their efficiency, but there is value to these institutions. Their value lies partly in the range of content that they provide, contributing to this kind of mixed ecology of programming. Their value lies in terms of the structured training and development that often many of them provide, and in supporting an independent production sector, but more crucially in terms of their accountability. Unlike many transnational corporations, they are or can be made to be accountable to the wider sector. This might be in relation to their commissioning strategies, in relation to their diversity targets, for instance. And while none of these things might be done perfectly, there is no obvious alternative single source of these interventions in the marketplace at the moment. So they fulfill a very real role in terms of developing a sustainable labour market. So one of the very real challenges for public service broadcasters around the world is funding. How do we find an effective and fair way to fund them? And associated with that, how do we communicate their value to a wide range of stakeholders? One of the funding models that seems to be kind of gaining traction within the UK is what we call contestable funding, very similar to the Sound and Vision funding that you have here. And I just want to raise some of the risks that have been actually raised by Roddy Flynn in relation to Sound and Vision, is that what happens when we remove funding from integrated public institutions to content alone? What do we lose when we shift from actually funding institutions to just funding content? And one of the areas is around whose responsibility and some of the structures around labour. This doesn't mean that commercial players are absolved of responsibilities to develop the labour market. How do we incentivise them or align them or assign responsibilities? For instance, how do we give them responsibilities around labour development? Particularly, and I'm thinking here about how we allocate funding, and it was interesting some of the discussions around Section 481. One of the things that I would suggest is that we should be looking at the effectiveness of that as a strategy. So what forms of research are we gathering in order to understand whether that kind of accountability has been more effective? What we need to think about, though, is what we need to think creatively about is how we balance flexibility and accountability. Infrastructure is strategically valuable, but is not enough on its own. A further element of our research was around the impact of capital investment on the labour market. We're not economists. We didn't do an economic study. There are plenty of those around, and there are plenty of people who can speculate on kind of forms of return in the form of kind of multipliers and financial investment. Our study was different. We wanted to understand the more intangible risks and rewards of a creative industries approach that builds things, that builds studios, that builds theatres, that builds cinemas, that builds creative hubs or offices. And in the UK, there's been a plethora of public and private investment in either establishing these new production ecologies or formalising existing ones. Phil has written about Titanic Porter in Belfast. Dennis Murphy has written about Ardmore Studios. Andrew Spicer has written about some of the infrastructure within Bristol. We looked at Roselock development in Cardiff. So this is a £20 million permanent, purpose-built centre of excellence for drama production. We're going to make a drama in this new purpose-built. And it's a contract between the BBC, Welsh Government and a private developer, Igloo Development. And currently Roselock houses Doctor Who, is kind of main production in there. But so, as I mentioned earlier, Casualty and also Public Hub are also co-housed or co-hosted within that as well. And so what we found is that investments like these do deliver material benefits for individual workers and for the sector. There's a greater occupational stability due to a number and range of productions being clustered together. Workers are able to hear and see opportunities and move between those. It also represents a structure within which professional mobility can happen. This is especially in relation to the transition from mid-career to established career in areas such as writing. People moving, starting on a smaller production and moving upwards into a bigger production. Therefore, investments in studios can deliver value in terms of career stability and development for both emerging and prominent talent. It builds a critical mass of expertise that can be sold internationally and offers tangible evidence of that to attract further investment. And again, the link between indigenous and international production. This is Welsh Government talking about their rationale for supporting Roselock, and you can see particularly the kind of the international profile is very vivid in this account. Capital investment is often preferred by politicians, as in the right conditions you can build something relatively quickly, you can stand outside it, you can take a photograph, you can cut a ribbon, and you can point to it as something for your constituents to see as being delivered. That makes it slightly different from labour, which is often intangible, much longer term, and leaves, quite frankly. But there are risks to these things, and particularly in terms of them becoming closed shops and closing down the diversity of voices. And this has to be something that needs to be considered very carefully in relation to infrastructure. Clustering doesn't automatically result in new voices. In fact, it can be the opposite. It can become a space in which people feel shut out. And so how do we allow new voices to come into these spaces? And so attention to the dynamics of the space. It also rarely works on its own, and it needs other resources such as partners and interventions. Some of these around deepening skills and deepening the kind of the things that orbit these spaces. So for instance, if you think about how many creative careers have stalled as a result of not having affordable accommodation in both London and Dublin. So while we can build studios, it's also about what is the wider policy infrastructure that they are positioned within and sit within. Therefore, infrastructure like studios are an important resource, but they're rarely enough on their own. And when planning these, we need to think purposefully about the mechanisms and support for the labour market that are housed within them. They don't just allow, they don't just encourage the labour market. There has to be some form of strategy around that. Let me go back. So I said at the outset that labour needs a range of stakeholders to intersect and coalesce. And I would propose that one resource which can help reach that point of intersection is research. If done well, good research can often be that collective resource for a sector. I often hear from the creative sector that if we just had data on X, everything would change. And sometimes that is the case. Research can be a catalyst for change. And I'm hoping yours is a catalyst for change. In Wales, a series of media audits have taken place in the last few years. And they've examined the state of media in Wales, not just in TV, but also in news and in radio. And what was interesting about those was it brought together the financial and expert resources of policymakers, industry, and academics, and has been a useful nudge. I've heard this word this morning, nudging. We need to do more nudging, and this has been a useful nudge, particularly a very public nudge for more accountability from the main players in Wales. It hasn't fixed things overnight, but it has created an agenda around which groups can mobilise. It has made the broadcasters reassert their commitment to Wales for additional spending and commissioning. And it has brought things like the issue of TV back into the political agenda, and an inquiry by the Welsh Assembly into government strategy can be seen as part of the legacy of that initiative. A further audit is planned for 2020 to assess whether there has been an effective change in the sector, whether the queries or the kind of issues that were raised here have been addressed. While this has been, or I would regard this as a success, the research wasn't particularly groundbreaking or innovative methodologically. It took a lot of data that was already in the public domain. It used networks that already exist to access internal data. And it just took a lot of graft from some key people in the sector. Two reasons why I think it was successful was firstly the nature of the data. And I think one of the things that in doing research or thinking about research, we need to think strategically about is the nature and style of that research. Whether we are doing census data, whether we are doing research data, or whether we are doing evaluation, and they are different and they do serve different purposes. Census data allows us to kind of take a temperature at this moment. Research allows, like what Dennis and Ruth have done, allow us to ask questions and generate new forms of knowledge, whereas evaluation is about testing something. And I think that in formulating a research strategy for the sector, we need all three in order to have a more complete picture, and particularly because each has a different purpose. It will appeal to different readers and different stakeholders, and if the job is to persuade, we need to think carefully about the appropriateness of the data. And there's more and more, certainly in the UK and certainly across our universities, there's more and more examples of fruitful collaboration between academics and industry around data collection, and we're getting better at understanding the risks and rewards of data collection and what it might look like when we co-produce knowledge. I think the second reason that this research worked was because there were some key senior people backing it. People who championed the findings and brought them to the fore publicly. They maintained pressure and they communicated the implications of the data in a way that went beyond simply the numbers. They told a story of what the implications were and would be. The research didn't just speak for itself, it found credible voices to give it life. I'll go back to the middle will look after itself. This is part of a quote, actually, that I have here. It comes from a quote from our research on Rothlock, and from somebody in the sector involved in training and development, and I think it is quite a common approach to the sector. And certainly we've seen it in a number of different countries. But I do want to raise the risks with that. Partly in relation to some of the themes of diversity that I raised earlier, and I think, Fran, you were kind of hinting a little bit at some of this about the middle part of the sector and what are some of the particular challenges for that element of the sector. Often we see strategies which focus on labour at either end of the spectrum. They're either at entry level, the kind of support of education, apprenticeships, work simulations, things like that. Or on the other side around senior talent, particular forms of funding or established networks and things like that. Focusing on these either end suggests that the skills and power and security of one group will be redistributed to everybody else. And that simply is not the case in every case. What our recent research repeatedly points to is that we need interventions at every stage of the labour market. For those starting out, of course, for those in senior positions, but also for those in the middle tiers. Especially within television, as the majority of below-the-line workers, what we call the crew, fall into this category. In effect, we are marginalising these workers by focusing on the relatively narrow experience of people who are either senior or new entrants. And there are specific things that we need to think about with these roles. Upskilling, limits to their mobility, access to money, particularly development financing, for instance. And we need to think about structured support across the lifetime of a worker rather than at beginning or at senior levels. Furthermore, ignoring this middle is also entirely connected to the high levels of attrition in the sector. So we need to think imaginatively about how we support this part of the sector. This is one kind of example of this in action, of how thinking about different, how this particular production is thought about, how it actually organises production to ensure that its kind of middle tiers are supported within the production environment. Finally, I want to change tack a little bit and to just consider my role as both a researcher and as a teacher. As a teacher, I work directly with many young people, the majority of whom hope to have a creative career. And it's a privilege to work with these young people and to help them enter the sector. And while there's plenty of people who would argue that degrees and third level qualifications are not necessary, the reality is that most people who work in our creative sector professionally are qualified to that level. Research in the UK testifies to that, and without spoiling what's coming up later, Ruth and Dennis's work reiterates this here in Ireland. Not having a degree, though more accurately, not having the networks that come from that education, not having the soft skills that are developed through coursework and ongoing coursework, not having the space to develop creative identity in a relatively safe environment is an impediment to a successful career in the creative sectors. Therefore, third level is a gateway to creative career, and I want to reflect on what that means and what are some of our responsibilities. In our book, Kate Oakley framed the relationship between education and industry as now more formal, more measured, and more calculating. And that has been a good thing. In the UK, there has been an emphasis on developing curricula in response and in conjunction with industry. I work alongside fantastic industry practitioners who supplement their creative work through teaching in third level, and there is a more authentic realization of creative practice. And so lots of good things are happening. However, for those of us working in the education system, I think it's also an opportunity to pause and reflect. In what way does our education system play a part in reproducing, rather than redressing, some of the problematic parts of the sector that I've outlined? How are the spaces for education complicit in the inequalities of the sector? So, for instance, in our admissions practices, how are third level institutions ensuring that there is a diverse range of young people able to make that transition into the sector? We've committed, or a lot of institutions in the UK are committed to widening access, but is that actually delivering a diversity in terms of who's entering? In creating our curriculum, do we allow for creative diversity and experimental cultural production, or are we already beginning to instill the ideas that certain forms of output are more desirable, usually certain forms of economic forms are more desirable? And in providing fantastic things like industry collaborations, simulations and work placements, are we ensuring that the resources and safe environment for self-reflective work are there? Because often creating work can be very exposing. In our book, Anamik Saha, writes about the value of university spaces and third level spaces for ethnic minority groups or for ethnic minority students who are also trying to reconcile their own creative practice in a sector in which they are often marginalised on screen. Are we creating curricula that allow people to fail creatively and learn? Are we putting in place pre-placement preparation, pastoral care, and perhaps most pressing, the financial support to undertake the range of very exciting opportunities such as work placements and things like that? How many of the institutions actually provide some kind of bursary for students to go and do the actual placements that we set up? And I think this is especially acute in the midst of a mental health crisis, and I use that deliberately, that word crisis deliberately, amongst young people in the UK. Though I did see a headline recently up in the Irish Times to say that there is a similar crisis within mental health of young people here in Ireland also. And finally then, who are the winners and losers following graduation? As we see an expansion of the provision of education as one way of building the labour market, we also have a responsibility to ensure it corresponds with real opportunities. An oversupply of workers and of certain skills in certain areas means that the cycle of lower economic prospects and further precarious work deepens, and we need to monitor this carefully through research and through ensuring following our graduates beyond their graduation. So, to conclude, I just want to return to my earlier questions. I certainly don't want to suggest that I'm the first person to raise these, and it's very clear from this morning's discussion that a lot of these discussions are well advanced. And I also don't want to suggest that this is the last word or that I am providing lots of answers. In many ways, today's talk is generally a provocation for us to reflect on the labour market we want to see, not just in terms of numbers, but also in terms of experience. Countries like Ireland and Wales have an advantage. There is an economic necessity for us to think imaginatively about creative labour because it is our main natural resource. Our space to direct change is potentially narrower, though that in itself can be problematic, and our direct line to power is shorter. So we need to make use of that. As outlined in this talk, we also need to share areas of best practice and models for effective intervention. What is working in different sectors? What is working in different countries that we can apply, that we can think about in relation to our own context? We need to acknowledge and challenge the myth of meritocracy. And with that, moving from thinking about individual experiences to thinking about structural opportunities and barriers, and therefore beginning to address questions of diversity in the creative sector. We need to build career structures and frames that allow mobility between productions and support entire work careers. We need to make the argument for public funded media in terms of their contribution to the labour market. We need to find creative ways to incorporate, incentivise and assign responsibilities to commercial and new players like Netflix. We need to recognise the value of infrastructure of different scales, but not to overstate that either. In doing this, I'm hoping we can reclaim the idea of sustainability not simply as something economic or just as some form of hollow corporate social responsibility, but which can actually deliver increased commercial and creative advantage and address areas of skill shortage in a small nation and make better working lives for those in the sector. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to Caitriona for a fascinating and a talk which has raised many different questions. We do just have a couple of minutes for questions because we don't want to keep you from your caffeine. But who would like to go first? And as before, if you can introduce who you are at the beginning, and if we can also use the microphone, as Jeffrey quite correctly reminded us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. PJ Matthews is my name from UCD School of English Drama and Film. I'm also a member of the RT board, so wearing that hat. So it's very hard to hear your comments in relation to public service.
I consider he didn't pay me.
Broadcaster, no.
At least I didn't get the check yet.
No, not yet. We're waiting for a license fee for that to happen. I welcome your concentration on sustainability. I think that's very useful for all of us to be thinking about the challenges that face us all in relation to the public service national broadcaster, tens of millions have been shaved off the budget for independent production over the last 10 years as we've had the freeze of the licence fee and an incredibly inefficient collection method, and it seems that that issue is not being addressed as urgently as it needs to be, unfortunately. And we're still very much living, I think, in the post-austerity funding scenario, you know, in ways which echo what Willie and Anne were saying in relation to theatre earlier on this morning. So oftentimes the debate here gets construed as a kind of a zero-sum game between the national broadcaster and industry, which I think is really disabling and short-circuiting. So I was very heartened to hear your analysis, which says basically that the public service broadcaster is an incredibly important driver in terms of the wider industry. In terms of, I was thinking when you were talking about the casualty and so forth, the role of something like Fair City, the job that it does here, and it doesn't get the profile of a love-hate or whatever the case may be. Anyway, my wider question is, two questions really, is how do we get to, how can we integrate those elements to get a kind of greater income? In other words, for industry and the public service broadcaster to be pulling together for the greater benefit of a wider momentum within the industry. So I suppose that's one thing, and I know we're all asking questions, and maybe forums like this help ways in which we can think about that. The second thing is, I was interested in your Enterprise Ireland experience as well. It seems to me that there's a huge gap on the one side between the Arts Council and its funding of the traditional arts, if you like, the hard arts to some degree, and Enterprise Ireland, which tends to be more focused on industry. Is there a somewhere in between? Is there something we can think about that might somehow bridge those two, or create an interface between people working in the arts or starting out in the arts and trying to move towards industry, the creative industries?
Specifically in Ireland?
Yeah, I guess so. Specifically,
I probably wouldn't feel comfortable. It's been a long time since I worked for Enterprise Ireland.
Fair enough. Sorry, I've given you. Yeah. So if you want to just concentrate on that.
I think, if you don't mind, I'll concentrate on the first one. I think, how I've interpreted this, how do public service broadcasters and indies pull together? And I think certainly in the UK, and I will put a bit of a health warning on this, because I think when we talk about institutions like the BBC, we have to be very careful that the BBC is in many ways an anomaly in public service broadcasting and in television in general. There are no other public service broadcasters that have the resources and have the scale of the BBC. In effect, they are a public service broadcaster, but they are out on their own. And I think where I would actually draw much more around the experiences is my experience of working with the Welsh language broadcaster S4C. And I think and I suppose it's to acknowledge that there hasn't always been a good relationship between the two. There has been a certain amount of mistrust, and I think particularly around transparency has been a big issue for how the public service broadcasters and the indies have worked together historically or not worked together historically. And I think that commitment to being more transparent about the systems of commissioning and about how the decision making happen has been useful. I think also it has also been useful, and then this does kind of bring back in the BBC, but perhaps more BBC Wales rather than BBC as a full institution, is the visibility of the commissioners publicly and being accountable for some of their decisions. And meeting indies and talking to indies and actually forming a relationship with a wider variety of indies and a wider spectrum of indies. We've often had this issue in the UK that if you want to be an indie in the UK, you have to go to London, and I think that the broadcasters have been under more pressure to kind of decentralise, and part of that is physically decentralising. In the UK, we're about to have Channel 4, which is one of the other big public service broadcasters that often people forget about, is just about to move out of London and into Leeds and Glasgow and Bristol. And I think that kind of visibility locally and that kind of visibility and the relationships that they can form with indies locally, I think is really important. And then there's also obviously metrics around, being transparent about how much is being commissioned. And I think that has been, in the UK, we've just Ofcom are, we can be quite cynical and say that there has been a history of lift and shift with the BBC, moving productions just because they fit under a different quota. And I think that kind of the transparency, I think, it goes back to the transparency about how important that is in terms of the relationship between. But I think it's also that indies need to recognise that often public service broadcasters are an important part of the ecology, and they need them, even if they're not perhaps directly working with them, that they are also a useful resource to have in this mixed ecology.
We could be on the safe side as well.
Absolutely. But because I think that's the thing, is that if we're going to make the argument, I think historically, and here I'm kind of drawing on some of the work done by the European Broadcast Union, public service broadcasters have been bad at telling people what they do and the kind of value. It's often been very much about the content, and the value, the kind of invisible value, hasn't really come to the fore. And I think that public service broadcasters are having to get better at, and have to get better at making the argument as to why they're valuable, but also having to bring in different constituents like indies into the picture as well.
There may be something to learn from the third level funding sector in terms of the impact and so forth in relation to all of that.
In what way?
In terms of the measuring impact and being from the commissioning process to end product, having a sense of what the impact of the content might be, and to align funding with a more open and transparent sense of that in the way that you're talking about there.
Some of the most powerful research has been from Ofcom in terms of looking at the kind of how much is being spent in Wales compared to the population of Wales and things like that. And it's that kind of accountability that does allow change, because public service broadcasters are accountable, and you can make them, you can publicly hold them to account in a way that you can't with a lot of other broadcasters.
Thank you. We have a question here at the front from Jeffrey. Yep.
Thanks. Quick observation before I get to my main point. That is, my understanding, you'll know much better than me, that the move of the BBC and part of the ITV to Salford has not led to the generation of a huge amount of indies in the way that somehow people dream. But that's not the main point I wanted to make, and this is an observation. I wanted to get to your point about fail safely. As a university teacher within the creative sector, risk and its management are critical to creative activity, and also critical to building creative enterprises and careers. It's the way you understand the risks you're taking, creative and other risks, and manage them. And then in that setting, fail safely, and the ability to fail safely, is not just a matter of social responsibility or social justice for those teaching and helping students. It's actually about making sure we've got a creative future.
Yep.
And I'm wondering whether you're finding that in the UK, certainly students in creative disciplines are becoming less and less willing to take risks, and that's with real damage for the future of the creative sector.
I would absolutely, and I'll look to my other academic colleagues to see whether this extends beyond Cardiff University. But certainly our experience in Cardiff University, and partly because it's partly because of the professionalisation narrative. We are constantly telling students that university is an opportunity to professionalise. And to professionalise in this sector is quite a public thing, having a LinkedIn profile and having a portfolio of work, and yet at the same time, and having that made visible. And so they recognise that the risks of making bad work or making work that doesn't stand up can be incredibly visible. And so they are much more reluctant they are much more risk averse. And I think we kind of compound that because we're kind of constantly talking about, you need to be professionalising. One of the first, and I'm not sure about what will happen here in Freshers Week, but one of the first things that they get at Cardiff University when they arrive is just like, oh, well, you have the library, but you also have the enterprise services, you have you have all these kind of this, you should already have a LinkedIn profile, and you should already be professionalising here, and you should, and that does create a sense that they are emerging professionals. They're not students, they're not learners, they're emerging professionals or new professionals, and I think that inevitably makes them more risk averse because they're a generation that's grown up with social media and the pitfalls of social media and how quickly a mistake can be made public. I'm not sure if that speaks to the experience of other institutions, Trinity or Ulster, but certainly in Cardiff. And I would say that is a new thing. I find that students, and also there's also a sense that having a degree is no longer just enough. It has to be a first-class degree, and so that also makes you risk-averse in certain cases. There is a sense that if everybody has a degree, you have to have the best degree, and you have to have a first-class degree, even though I'm sure that doesn't have any bearing on whether they get a job or not, but that sense that, and I think we have to do more work around that and kind of saying that actually within the creative sector, yes, if you work in business and if you are an accountant, maybe if you do get a first-class degree, you go straight into KPMG. If you get a first-class degree, it's not necessarily the sense that you're going to go straight into
Maybe you have to actually give first-class marks to the most risky and challenging and sometimes less successful work.
You do, and you find the problem often is that risky work doesn't fit within the criteria because we're also trying to be equitable and transparent in terms of how we assess the work, and it doesn't always fit. So there's a lot of dynamics, but I do think we do need to be having this conversation about, are we, in the emphasis on professional development, are we over-professionalising them too early? I think is probably my question. But I'm happy to take if
probably just for reasons of time, we'll maybe just go to a final question. We can certainly discuss further, I'm sure, over coffee.
Come and tell me about your university students.
I did have someone already caught my eye here at the front, so we'll take the last question here, and then Caitriona, I'm sure you're happy to speak further over coffee.
Yeah, I'm very happy to chat.
Final question, just
First of all, thanks for speaking on these issues. I think it's all really important. My name's Glenn Kaufman. I had been a screenwriter. I'm now a freelance sound editor. Was also happy to hear you talking about the importance of supporting mid-career professionals.
Yeah.
And as someone who sort of switched and retooled and rebranded in mid-career, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the challenges of switching midstream and of rebranding, and how policy could support that, those sorts of things.
Well, I think you can probably speak better to the experience of it. I'll probably speak more to the policy around it. I think just to reiterate my point, I just think that we often neglect crew within policy. If you look at the policy documents, they're very rarely referenced. They are often invisible. And they're often made as the kind of, they are the thing that is attractive to international production, but they're also the things that can be, made invisible in terms of wages, in terms of contracts and things like that. So I think the first challenge is making those jobs and those roles and the entirety of those roles visible within the policy space. I'm always really surprised when I talk to policymakers, and this might be the difference in Ireland, I'm not sure, but certainly in the UK, the people who make policy for creative industries often come from very different creative industries. And so in any one inquiry or any one committee, you have people who are coming from lots of different creative industries, and they don't really know a lot about what the sector is.
They don't understand the experience.
They don't understand the experience. And often, one of the challenges in engaging with policymakers is I'm having to talk with kind of two registers. The one that kind of says, this is what TV is, and then the much more, people who are much more expert, who actually know the sector, and trying to reconcile those, and then trying to get those, the differences of experience within the policy space really, really challenging, because they often think about creative industries as a single thing.
Right.
So theatre is the same as television, is the same as film, which there are parallels and there are overlaps, but there's distinctions I think that need to be addressed. And then even within, when they talk about TV, so for instance in the recent Wales inquiry, it was all about high-end TV, and yet they didn't mention anything about post-production. So you have a lot of, and I think the job for us is to kind of keep reiterating to them and engaging with them when they are doing evidence or gathering evidence and things like that there are the variety of experience, but I think particularly it's the invisibility of these mid-career and particularly the invisibility of crew, I think has been very pronounced within TV policy. certainly in the UK, I'm not as familiar with Ireland.
Okay, we shall wrap up there, and as we do, let's just thank Caitriona.